We're going to start part 2 of our discussion on intercultural communication. Part 2 meaning part 1's we've already accomplished part 1 in some fashion or another. And the key ideas we're going to cover in today's discussion are to look at somehow defining communication, uses of communication, characteristics of communication, and characteristics and functions of culture. Our discussion extends the discussion of intercultural communication by expanding both the concept of communication and the concept of culture. We call it the voice and the echo. And I'm not going to lie to you, we often think about this in terms of the chicken and the egg, which came first. Because you cannot really have culture without communication, and communication doesn't really exist without it being laid within some sort of culture. So when we talk about the uses of communication, we talk about the idea, first off, that communication and identity, how we identify ourselves, is important, and it happens through communication. What are we called? How are we called? How do we define who we are? And how we define who we are often says a lot about the culture from which we come. We're going to look at communication and person perception, and communication and persuasion. These are the uses. These are the uses of communication as we move forward. Because when we start talking about, for example, communication and the whys, one of the things that we can't dismiss is what I'm going to refer to as psychological and communicative imperatives. And those imperatives might even be displayed in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Oh, here it is again. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You probably hear about the concept of Maslow and his hierarchy of needs in probably every psychology class you've ever taken, probably every communication class you've ever taken, probably every sociology class you've ever taken, anthropology, and a host of other disciplines. But when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about thinking in terms of levels of need and accomplishment that must be obtained before we can even advance to other levels. So we might think in terms of the first one being the physical needs, that being air, food, sex, meaning the propagation of the species. Okay, and until we can actually accomplish those, we often don't look at safety and protection, which might mean shelter specifically. Belongingness needs, inclusion, fun, self-esteem needs being respect and accomplishment, and then self-actualization, which according to Maslow is, you might guess, the most abstract human need. It's where we develop fully our talents, capacities, and personalities. And we also have the capacity at this point to give back to the culture and give back to the society. So why is it important in communication? 2 things. Number 1, none of these things can be accomplished in any culture or in any society without communicating with each other. Can't happen. And number 2, even when we talk about communication skills, and you're in a communication course, we are talking about having to deal with levels of communicative skill, whether it's intercultural, whether it's public speaking, whether it's interpersonal, small group, nonverbal, you name it, whatever aspect of communication we're talking about having to deal with skills. Now let's take a look at public speaking for a moment. I've got people in public speaking class that come to my classes on a regular basis who are suffering from severe physical manifestations of speech anxiety. They're just deathly afraid to get up and talk in front of people. And when that happens, we are more concerned sometimes of allowing them to look at the basic idea of getting up, even saying a few lines of script or saying something in front of a group, and then sitting back down. For them, that's an accomplishment. So if I were to talk about the finer points, for example, of hand gestures during a presentation, the likelihood is it's not going to be paid attention to and not really hit home because they're just not there and they're just not ready for it. You know, I immediately think of, for instance, when we start talking about this, I immediately think of a skill that was picked up on because of some speech coaches and some counseling by JFK, and then eventually by Bill Clinton. And whether or not you like Bill Clinton, because it doesn't matter to me whether or not you like him, the fact is one can't deny that he was an excellent, a superb public speaker. He could captivate audiences in the hundreds and thousands, if not millions, and just keep people riveted. But he, early on in his career, had to develop a certain gesture, or rather get rid of a certain gesture. Now, there are some gestures that people will find almost insulting. If I'm actually looking at people and I'm having a conversation, I might give you the fist as I'm talking. Well, this is a very antagonistic gesture, isn't it? And I might either be trying to rile you up, or I might be shaking that fist at you. Depending upon your interpretation, you're not going to find this to be overly friendly. On the other hand, I might give you the thumbs up. And if I'm giving the thumbs up while I'm speaking, I'm often trying to indicate to people that I'm agreeing, and I want you to agree with everything that's being said. That doesn't always happen either, so that gesture as a regular gesture isn't really going to work. Or even worse, I might be pointing my finger. Now, when I point my finger because I'm trying to make a point, often what happens is this causes us to have flashbacks to our early disciplinarians when we were growing up, and nobody likes to have their finger being pointed at them. And in fact, some of you right now, if you're looking at the finger being pointed at you, are kind of thinking, wait a minute, don't be pointing that finger at me. And so JFK and Bill Clinton developed this kind of combination. And you may recognize this gesture, where what they started doing, instead of pointing, they learned to wrap their finger around their thumb, making a closed fist. And as they were actually making various points, they were using that finger wrapped around the closed thumb to make those points from a nonverbal perspective and punctuate those points. These are skills we can't teach basic public speaking students who are currently at the level, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that physical level, for instance. We can't teach. They're physically afraid of getting up and speaking at all. And as such, can we talk about the finer points of nonverbal gestures? We can't, because they're not ready for it. So when we talk about interpersonal, intercultural, nonverbal, any of these skills, we're also talking about that psychological and communicative imperative that suggests we've got to be ready to open our minds to where we're going. And it takes communicative skill in order to do that. And so when we start looking at communication, human communication at all, one of the things we need to start paying attention to is the skill itself involved, not the fact that it takes communication to acquire the various aspects of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but it takes communication skill just to get along and navigate with people. And there are various levels of skill that can be learned. So that's what we're going to talk about at some time, at some point, and many points as we go along this particular semester. Okay. We live in a diverse society with different languages and different cultures within our own society, don't we? I didn't grow up in the same culture you did. Even if we live next door to each other on the same block in the same town. There are different family rituals that you probably have that I didn't have, and vice versa. And as such, there are different things to pay attention to. And when we are talking about those different cultural aspects as growing up, we are living in diversity. We are living with some people who may be drastically different than us, and we may be living with people who are somewhat similar but have little differences than us. In order to actually punctuate and figure out the nuances of those differences, communication needs to take place. So when we try to define communication, our book describes it as human communication is a dynamic process in which people attempt to share their thoughts with other people through the use of symbols in particular settings. It's a dynamic process. It's ever changing. So if we use language to navigate society, and if the greater society represents a greater collection of varying cultures, language and culture reflect each other, the voice and the echo, the chicken and the egg. Language is symbolic. Now, of course, we talk about symbolism in a number of communication courses. But when we talk about symbolism, we talk about three different qualities and characteristics of symbolism in particular that always needs to be part of a conversation when we talk about symbols. The first is that the first quality of a symbol is first that it is arbitrary. Arbitrary means that we decide. Arbitrary means that we decide. So at some point, if I have this in my hand, and I ask you, what is this? Many of you might look at this and say, that's a pen. And I'm going to ask you, is there something intrinsic about the idea that pen and this item right here coincide with each other? Is there an intrinsic connection between pen and this? The answer is no. Somewhere in history, somebody gave this a name. Depending upon the language that people speak, it's a different name. Which tells us that if we all decided today, collectively as a society, that we're going to call this an apple, this is an apple. Somehow we decided, somewhere in history, we decided to give it a name, and this is what it's going to be called, a pen. Other languages, other people in other cultures will call it something different based on their language, which tells us that symbolism is arbitrary. Somewhere we decide what the symbol means. The second characteristic that we want to talk about with respect to symbolism is the idea of ambiguity. Symbols are ambiguous. It's subject to multiple meanings. Symbols are ambiguous because their meanings vary from person to person and context to context. Meanings aren't entirely clear-cut. Politicians use this all the time to get votes, don't they? Think about the politician who might say, if you are a patriot, you'll vote for me. Well, therein lies the word patriot. Could a patriot be defined as something by some party or some group and something completely different by somebody else? Sure it could. What does patriotism mean? There's no clear-cut, specific definition, and a lot of politicians are hoping you don't call them out on that. And when they give presentations and when they give speeches, they will use a lot of buzzwords to try and bring people together to vote for them and not necessarily clearly define their position, because that's dangerous for them. So symbols can also be ambiguous. And symbols can also be abstract, which means it's removed from concrete reality. They are abstract because they are inferencing and generalizing from reality. What do I mean? Words stand for ideas. People, events, objects, feelings, and so forth. But they are not the things itself that they represent. They are not the things itself that they represent. So, for example, in cultures, we might go to France, for instance, and if you ask the typical French citizen what they think about Americans, believe it or not, they're going to say Americans are all rude. They don't care much for Americans. Now, I am also generalizing by saying that, aren't I? But I'm also using the abstract idea of both Americans and bringing up the concept of rudeness. I'm marrying them together. And as a French citizen, for instance, who might say this, we might say, okay, I'm going to now recall all the instances where Americans have been rude, thus bolster my idea that Americans are rude, and completely forget any other time when Americans weren't rude. Okay? I'm calling the abstractness because I'm bringing in inferences of what it means to me to be American, not being one if I'm a French citizen. Okay. So when we start talking more about the uses of communication, we talk about communication and identity. Defines who you are. Communication defines who you are. Whether this is by direct definition, I am an American, I am an Irishman, I am a Polish person. Whether we talk about ethnicity, I am male. Whether we talk about gender, I am 107 years old. Whether we talk about age, whatever it might be, we might be defining ourselves by direct definition, but in so doing, we're also defining ourselves by our culture. I am single, I am married, I am husband, I am son, I am father. Or by reflected appraisal. How do people respond to you? Do they respond to you as if you are in a particular role? Teacher, student, waiter, waitress? Do they respond to you as you are a particular member of a family? Mothers will respond to their sons differently than they will respond to their fathers. Because when they're responding to their fathers, they're no longer acting in the role of mother, they're acting in the role of daughter, aren't they? And so our roles change. Communication also defines our affiliation, doesn't it? Our loyalties. Who are we spending our time with? Who do we choose to spend our time with? It defines where we belong geographically. How can I tell? Dialect, potential accents, regionalisms, our names, our nicknames. Oftentimes those things define where we are, where we're from. Because those nicknames and those names aren't going to be universal all over the world. They're going to be characteristics, for example, of where your families or people with your family name settled, moved to, relate. Communication also deals with person perception, doesn't it? It enables you to learn about another person. It assists you in how you will describe yourself to others. We learn about other people from conversations and from observation. And we are also then giving off the same perception of ourselves to others, the impression of ourselves to others, by what we choose to wear, how we choose to act and behave, how we choose to communicate, what we choose to communicate. Communication also helps us conquer our interpersonal needs. Am I going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs here? Sure I am. It's only through communication that these needs can be fulfilled when dealing in a social world. And what choice do we really have anymore? There is no opportunity for us to find a place on this planet to be hermits. And if there is, it's really rare. It's very, very rare that if we chose not to have any dealings with any human being whatsoever, that's even possible. It's just not in today's overpopulated day and age. Within the journey of accomplishing any task within society, it's often necessary to persuade somebody to help us in some fashion to accomplish these needs that we require. As a consequence, communication also deals with persuasion. How do I convince, cajole, encourage you to assist me? Or how do I convince you to take my help? Or how do I convince you that we can help each other? So when we talk about communication, we talk about various models, of course. Those models might be linear, whereas communication only goes in one direction. Sender, message, receiver, and it goes that way. Now, models like that often don't recognize the idea that communication is a two-way street, that there is feedback that comes back. It might be a model of interactive communication where I'm looking at an encoder, somebody who creates a message, who is also the sender of the message. We've got that message being sent to a receiver who is a decoder, to try and understand what that message was, who then becomes an encoder, sends feedback, another message, to the what used to be the encoder, now the decoder. Now, interactive models will often kind of give us the idea that communication is cyclical and that it happens in turn-taking, but it doesn't typically acknowledge the fact that it happens simultaneously. And when we talk to people back and forth in general, we're often talking about what we might refer to as a transactional model, which accounts for communication also across time. Now, if you want to get more detail into these, you want to refer back to your discussions you've had with interpersonal communication. But when we start talking about components of communication, we talk about a source. Where's the message come from? That message needs to be created or encoded. The message itself then is created and exists. We have a channel, whether it be the airwaves, or my vocal cords, text messaging, television, email. There is some sort of channel that then gets to the receiver, who then decodes, and then will provide feedback. And oftentimes this will happen simultaneously. And we often have to deal with noise, don't we? Now, most of us, when we hear the word noise, we're thinking about that physical decibel level that might actually get in the way of us understanding someone else from trying to talk to us. That's not always the case, although that is one type of the 6 types of noises that are often discussed. And those 6 types of noises are, number 1, physical. Okay, this is your noise that I'm referring to that we often think about, that high decibel level. Have you ever tried to have a conversation with somebody at a rock and roll concert? It's really loud, and it's very difficult to do. The other one is physiological noise. Physiological noise. Those of you that are in the sciences and have taken classes such as anatomy and physiology recognize the word physiological in that we're referring to bodily processes. So is there something about my body or your body that keeps us from fully gaining the message that is being tried to be transmitted to me? And that could be, and that could include the fact that I may or may not be deaf and I have problems with my ears. That could be I may or may not be blind and I have problems with my eyes. It could mean I have problems with my vocal cords. It could mean I've taken more of a temporary issue. It could mean I'm allergic to something. I'm having an allergic reaction and my head is just all stuffed up and I feel like I'm on a cloud and not able to focus. It could be that I've taken too many antihistamines as a result of that allergy, and I'm in what I call an antihistamine fog, and I'm just not really there and present, able to pay attention. And there's a whole host of other ideas with respect to physiology and what could happen to our body to keep us from truly paying attention to what's going on. It could be psychological noise, the 3rd type of noise. Psychological noise. You're here listening to this discussion today, participating in this discussion today in intercultural communication, but in 2 hours you have a math exam. You spent all night, last night, studying for that math exam. And in so doing, are you fully present in this discussion right now? In 2 hours you have that math exam. The likelihood is you are not. You're running math formulas in your head while trying to pay attention to me at the same time. And that can be very difficult. It's an example of what we might call psychological noise. The 4th may be an emotional noise. What about your emotions is actually causing you to be distracted from being fully present in the moment? 20 minutes before you came to this particular discussion, you heard that one of your significant others just passed away. Got into a car accident, died instantly. What an incredible, horrible thing to have to deal with when you come into a course, when you come into a discussion. Is it even possible for you to be fully present in the discussion as it exists right now? The answer is incredibly unlikely. Incredibly unlikely. Your emotions are probably doing roller coasters as a result, and focus just isn't where you're at this moment. The 5th, environmental noise. Environmental noise. What about the room or the atmosphere around the conversation causes you not to be able to fully pay attention? the lights too dim, too bright? Is the air too hot or too cold? The colors of the wall, the arrangement of the chairs. Is there something about the environment that distracts you from obtaining fully the message that is being sent your way? Is there static on the line? Environmental noise. I often think about this as being very punctuated when we're having a conversation, and I've had conversations with people sometimes. It's dark outside, we're in a lit room, it's a big thunderstorm, lightning storm going on outside, and as such, the lightning eventually hits the transformer, kaboom! All the lights immediately go out. And I'm looking at the person and completely distracted because now I no longer see them. And perhaps whether consciously or unconsciously, I was paying attention to their visual feedback on what I was saying and how they were saying what they were saying. And I was relying on that visual feedback, and it's all of a sudden gone. Environmental noise. And finally, semantic noise. Semantic noise. The sixth type of noise. Semantic noise. Here we're dealing with words, language. Can language get in the way? Techno-jargon. People are speaking in jargon, in technical terms, about a particular field, whether it's computer science, medical science, or car repair, that you just don't know because you're not familiar with those words. One possibility. Accents and dialects. What's the difference? Dialects are different variations on the primary language being spoken. For example, there are 7 countries in the world where English is the official language. Now, in all 7 of those countries, is English spoken exactly the same? No, of course not. And in fact, English is not spoken exactly the same throughout all the parts of the country we're in right now. The primary language and the variations of that language, how it's spoken, dialect. Accents are primary language learning influencing your secondary language acquisition. Think about that for a minute. If your first language is Spanish or Chinese or Arabic or Hindi, and you've learned English, and now you're trying to speak with someone, you will have influences from your first native language that seep into your English speaking. You don't believe me? Go have a conversation with people who Spanish is their first language and work in a Mexican restaurant, for whom Chinese is their first language and currently work in a Chinese restaurant where you might have access to some of these individuals. Ethnic restaurants are a great place to listen to different accents. Or we might even deal with regionalisms being semantic noise. Regionalisms. And I've told this story a bunch of times before, I'll tell it again. When I first came to Southern Kentucky to teach, I came from Chicago. And when I came down here, I had a couple of days before the semester started. I printed off a couple of my syllabi. I walked over to our work study student, and I said, would you be so kind as to make copies for me of this particular syllabi so that I can be ready for the first day of class? The student looked at me and said, I don't care to. At which point I picked up the syllabi, started walking away. She looked at me like I was crazy and said, where are you going? You know what I don't care to sounds like to a northerner? It's a regionalism in this area that says, I'd be happy to, but I don't care, to a northerner says, it's not my job, don't bother me with this. And so I was going to go someplace else and either get someone else to do that particular project for me or do it myself because I was just being told it's not that person's job. When in fact they were volunteering and being very happy to help. Regionalisms can also be semantic noise. Okay. Characteristics of communication. First off, it's a dynamic process. It's always growing. And as a result, it not being static, I might say that I'm going to have a communication episode with you, and that's going to be completely different than a communication episode that I'm going to have with you at a later date. That's not true, is it? Because it's an always growing process, here's the key. Every communication that I have with someone is a continuation of every communication I've ever had with that person. Every communication I have with someone is a continuation of every communication I've ever had with this person. If we look at the transactional model of communication, one of the things that we recognize is that over time, our shared field of experience increases, and so now we have more things we can refer to in our conversations from our history. This is where inside jokes can come from, that other people are looking at you going, I don't get it, what are you two laughing about? Because all I did was say one or two words, we immediately, both of us recall this episode of communication we had previously, and a third party who might be there for the first time is really confused. Every communication we have with someone is a continuation of every communication we've ever had with that person. History is that important. Symbolic. When we talk about the characteristics of communication, it's symbolic, which means inferences are drawn from the symbols people produce. Well, we've already talked about what that means with respect to the characteristics of symbolism. It's arbitrary, it's ambiguous, and it's abstract. It's also contextual. Think about this for a minute. The words, I love you, mean very different things if it's said by a son or daughter to their mother. What if it's said to your friend? Just the person might change in the context, and the meaning changes. What if it's said to your spouse of 20 years? The meaning changes yet again. What if it's said to a person you've only been dating for 2 years? Meaning changes again. Or what if it's said to a person you just met yesterday? Now it's just getting creepy. Because, again, the meaning has completely changed yet again. Context, whether it's the location, the occasion, the time, the number of participants, or even the specific participants involved. The same communication can have very different meanings. As such, remember, communication lies within people. Meaning lies within people, not within words. The meaning lies within people, not within the words. Communication is also a learned behavior. We learn language from a very early age. We learn nonverbal behavior and what is acceptable from one culture to another culture, in what society we grow up in from a very early age. Even greeting behavior, for instance. You know, whether it's bowing when I first see someone, kissing them, where I might be kissing them, whether it's the cheek, the mouth, or the hand when I first see someone, shaking hands, or even how we greet people in general. You know, whether it's American, how are you? You know, how are you? How are ya? Depending upon how we're saying it. Or even in Hawaii, when I was teaching there, it was always, how's it? Or more formally, hello. Communication has consequences. One of the things we often don't realize, if we are of the computer generation and grew up with computers always as our constant companion and played computer games all the time, there was always that reset button if I made a mistake, wasn't there? I could always reset and start over. Human beings are not like that. When we make mistakes, we have to recognize that there are consequences to our actions. So unlike the computer game generation, there is no reset button on life. Communication is irreversible. Once it's said, as we said, it's out there. It can't be taken back. We might say that we're going to take it back, but it's still subconsciously on the minds of those around us. Communication changes people when you exchange messages. It makes them feel differently. A good word can make someone's day, lift them up. An insult can destroy them for weeks. Speech is also an act, isn't it? It can change your marital status by saying 2 words, right? It can also swear in a politician and make a private citizen a public official, just by the communicative act. So, what happens when we start talking about culture? The voice and the echo, the chicken and the egg. We cannot have one without the other. Edward Hall talks about culture as being, culture is communication and communication is culture. Edward T. Hall was a very famous anthropologist. Culture is shared and has shared meanings. Again, symbolism, isn't it? Symbolism. So, how is culture defined? It's a set of human-made objective and subjective elements that in the past have increased the probability of survival. Increased the probability of survival. If this group of individuals grew up, tried to survive on a coastline, geography has a very serious play in how we define culture, doesn't it? The likelihood is that particular culture turned out to be fishermen. More so than agricultural society, more so than a hunting society. Probably more fishermen. Because whatever they were doing, both objective and subjective elements in the past have increased the probability of survival and resulted in satisfaction for the participants, meaning they ought to have lived decent, happy lives, in an ecological niche, maybe the coastline for instance, and thus became shared among those who could communicate with each other because they had a common language and they lived in the same time and place. And it is through communication and a shared language that all of a sudden we're able to share what we're talking about, our livelihood, and our probabilities for survival. So when we talk about the increased probability of survival, we're often talking about sharing things like forms of medicine. How do we keep people healthy? Forbidden foods. You know, you start thinking about the various cultures where they can't eat this and they can't eat that. Well, one time in that history of that culture, that particular food probably had a very practical reason, if not seeped into the religious implications, but had a very practical reason as to why they couldn't eat it. Because for whatever reason, that food was unhealthy. Caused people to get ill, they couldn't clean it correctly, whatever it might be. Forbidden foods. Cooking habits. Cooking habits. How things are prepared. Types of shelters. The types of shelters are often dictated, for example, by the ecology. What building materials are available? The list goes on and on. These ideas of survival may have been unique to the location. So fishing versus farming. This was passed on to others, shared through their communication as they taught their progeny how to survive by teaching them this is how we live, this is how we hunt, gather, fish, etc. You know, Albert Einstein once said that common sense is a collection of prejudices acquired by age 18. Think about it. You learn everything there is to know probably about your specific culture by the age of 18. What's acceptable behavior? What are acceptable professions? And what's the common language? It might even be, when we talk about behavior, common sense. And how many of us have even gotten into that idea that, I invite somebody here, they're using a fork, but they didn't come from a culture that uses a fork. So they're trying very hard to use a fork and they're holding it in a funny way and they're trying to figure out how do I pick up the food and then how do I get it to my mouth? Maybe they grew up using chopsticks. But oftentimes it might be something, prejudices or habits or commonalities of what we've learned to accept as normal by the age of 18. Well, if we never used a set of chopsticks in our lives, and we went to Asia, anywhere, where chopsticks were the norm, they would look at us the same way we would look at someone who didn't quite understand how to use a fork. And we might even say, that's common sense, how can you not know this? Well, it's common sense in this culture. It may not be in another. And so that gives us an opportunity to start opening our minds and learning from each other rather than saying, how can you not know that? Okay. When we talk about functions of culture, when we start looking at culture itself, it teaches people how to adapt to their surroundings. Hopefully you're starting to get that idea as we start talking about this now. We're passing along previous knowledge and experiences to future generations. How do we teach our children to do and be successful in life that we have now taught ourselves, or that our parents or the older generations have taught us? The elements that are often existing here so that society can navigate within that group of people happily, with function, etc., are religion, history, values, social organizations, language. All of which they exist within the very definition of culture, and certainly are going to be discussed in the future discussions that we have here. So when we look at the characteristics of culture and we think about the idea that culture is learned, it's often learned informal through interpersonal means. We learn it by interacting with our families. We learn it by interacting with our friends or the people in our community. We watch and we learn acceptable behavior. How are we to act? We model the older members of our families often in order to learn how to do this. How are we to behave? We communicate with others in our native culture, and we're often told this as well as shown this. And how are we to pick up a lot of these values? Believe it or not, you learn culture from proverbs. In American culture, it might be, if we're talking about religion in fact, it might be from the Bible, or the Torah, or what other religious text that you may have, you may look at as an honored text in your religion. It might be from jokes. Think about that for a minute. If I'm going to tell you a joke that's going to specifically make one group of people look silly, I'm specifically trying to indicate to you what behavior is unacceptable. It might be from jokes. It might be from folk tales. It might be from fairy tales. It might be based on the heroes that we admire within the society, whether historically or currently. Legends, myths, art. Mass media, probably more so in the American society than anything else. Popular cultural TV shows. News programs. Entertainment programs. Churches. What's being said from the pulpit, from the lectern, from the altar, from the front of the assembly. Schools. What are your teachers saying as you grow? What are your, especially during your formative years in grade school? Clubs. The list, of course, goes on and on and on here as well. As parents teach the young within their family units, no matter how those family units may be composed, from culture to culture, we know that family units might be composed of different numbers and genders, etc. So the culture is also transmitted from generation to generation as well. So culture is passed on in symbols. Symbols tie people together. Are you catching this whole idea about symbols being a recurring theme? And culture is, in essence, at its very basis, symbolic. Did I not just say the same thing about communication? Again, the voice and the echo. The chicken and the egg. They reflect each other. People can package, store, and transmit symbols. Symbols can be verbal or they can be nonverbal. But when we say culture is dynamic, as we said communication is dynamic, we are saying that cultures, now here's where we get into a little bit of a paradox. Cultures can be subject to change at least some levels, not all. Changes can be brought about by new technology. Whether it's transportation technology, whether it's computer technology, whether it's industrial technology, changes can be brought about by technology. Changes today are more prolific. For example, the promoted rise of American capitalism throughout the world. The promoted popularity of Hollywood entertainment throughout the world. The promoted worldwide population growth. Changes are happening because we are becoming that more populous as a planet. The promoted large movement of immigrants. The more we become more populous, people have and the transportation technology is also changing. The more people have a tendency to want to move around for whatever reasons, economic, exploration, etc. Or the promoted proliferation of information. More and more people are subject to being able to get information that even governments can't control anymore. The internet has turned out to be an interesting changer as far as the game goes with respect to the planet. We, of course, find many similarities within the characteristics of culture that we also find in communication. And that's part of what we're talking about here. But, and here's where the paradox comes in. There are certain aspects of communication that are, of culture, that are very resistant to change. Culture is deeply rooted in tradition. Oftentimes when we talk about culture, we talk about traditions that date back hundreds, if not the oldest culture on the planet that is still surviving today being the Chinese culture, thousands of years. Okay? Cultures seek to endure. That's why we share with those who are of the younger generation. That's why we share with them, so that we understand that we want to pass it on. Whether it's the probability of survival, meaning you survive by learning to fish, you survive by, or maybe it's the tradition of learning various musical instruments to keep certain art activities alive. The deep structure of culture resists major alterations, and these may include things like government, laws, schools, churches, religions. Religions have not really changed, the various kinds of religions, over the hundreds, if not thousands of years either. You see fads come and go. But there are a set standard of various religious traditions that are very ingrained and entrenched in culture, that it will always be somehow related to the culture it seeks to endure. Popular culture may be open to change. Deep structural aspects of culture are not. And they include values, beliefs, roles of government, ethics, morals, religious practices, etc. And culture is an integrated system, as is communication. Culture is an integrated system. All parts of culture are interconnected, as all parts of communication are interconnected. We might be able, for example, to take apart communication, say, let's spend some time talking about the nonverbal aspects of this, and the verbal aspects of this, and the intention of the speaker here, and the ability of the receiver to get the message there. And we can slice it up and dice it up, but the fact is, it's greater than the sum of its parts. And when we look at communication and say, how does this all fit together, we somehow have to look at the whole integrated system for the overall effect. The same thing holds true for culture. Can I just look at the religion and understand a particular culture? Probably not. Can I just look at the government structure of a particular country and understand the culture? Probably not. Can I just look at the popular cultural trends of the day and understand a culture? Probably not. We've really got to take the whole integrated system. And although it's been a very popular historical opportunity for scholars to study culture by country lines, by political borders, that's even very difficult to do anymore because people keep moving and that various aspects of culture have a tendency to transcend even political boundaries. So Hall even says you touch a culture in one place and everything else is affected. You can change part of the system. You can change the laws. But if I change the law, for example, and you can even see it in the American system right now, and I'm not going to judge one way or the other and talk about it, but for example, the Obamacare administration, President Obama is trying to change the health care laws, and various religious organizations are up in arms because of some of the ramifications and the effects it has. You know, what they're required to potentially cover and pay for. That may go against what the overall religious beliefs may or may not be. You can touch it in one place, and it has effects on other places as well. Values can influence things like family size. So can the economy. Work ethic, use of time, and spiritual pursuits. Changes in technology can influence other cultural values, attitudes, and behaviors as well. More people are learning to play musical instruments and to do various other things because the technology for lessons and access to the ability to do and learn these things is at our fingertips if we will only turn off the remote and turn off the mass media that most of us have become addicted to. World economy and food supply, such as it is in any environment, may affect also family size, family composition, etc. You can't touch one, communication or culture, without having some serious reflection on the other. And that is, I think, the primary point of this discussion. And that's where we're going to continue our discussion and our thinking as we move forward, looking at communication and culture, the voice and the echo. They cannot and do not exist in isolation of each other.